Council.
Okay, our work session topic tonight is we have the Alaska Command and U.S. Navy representatives here to present the Northern Edge exercises 2019, and we'll have a question and answer for the public and council when they're done with their presentation. So I'll just turn it over to you guys to let you introduce yourselves, and I think they got a presentation here to give us, and we'll go from there.
Yes, sir. Thank you for having us. My name is Captain Bryant Davis. I'm the Director of Public Affairs for Alaska NORAD Region, Alaskan Command, and 11th Air Force. So a lot of alphabet soup right there for you. I'm joined here today by Mr. John Mosher from U.S. Pacific Fleet, Lieutenant Colonel Von Brazil from 11th Air Force, and Miss Amanda Andrashko from Alaskan Command. So Alaskan Command and 11th Air Force are both based here in Alaska up at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, and Mr. Mosher joins us from Whidbey Island in Washington State. Before we dive too deeply into Northern Edge, what I wanted to talk about is a little bit of the strategic picture that we're seeing with Alaska. And these are a few slides that we take out of our mission brief from Alaskan Command. And what you'll notice on the left is we've actually tilted the globe from the perspective of looking at the United States from the lower 48 to looking at the United States with Alaska being at the top of the world in the central part. And why that's important is because Alaska is strategically important to the Department of Defense for two reasons. One is Homeland Defense, and two is power projection. So you can see those flight times, and that's at a speed of about 0.75 Mach, which is similar to what an airline would fly. You can reach pretty much any capital within the Northern Hemisphere within hours. So it just underscores the importance that Alaska has for the Department of Defense. And what we're also seeing with the Arctic in this part of the world, and what we're really focusing on, is just the changing conditions that you're seeing. So as the sea ice continues to recede, that's starting to open up more human activity, whether that be trade routes with the Northern Sea Route or the Northwest Passage. And then we're also planning for maybe a point when the Arctic is a blue Arctic and you're able to sail across and push trade that way. And also thinking through the natural resources that are going to become available and the tourism opportunities. There was a cruise ship that went through the Northwest Passage a few years ago, and all of that increase in human activity can lead to a few different things. It could lead to increased conflict in the region, which the Department of Defense needs to be prepared for, or it could be a search and rescue operation that the Department of Defense needs to be prepared for. So when we're looking at the Arctic and we're looking at Alaska, there is definite interest in expanding our capabilities and our preparedness for operating in this region. With that, we'll dive into a little bit more on Northern Edge, and I'll turn it over to Lieutenant Colonel Brazil.
Thank you. So this year for Northern Edge 19, U.S. Indo-PACOM is the joint headquarters staff that is in charge of the event, and that includes every branch of service. They have designated the Pacific Air Forces, or PACAF for short, as the executive agent to coordinate and organize the event. So it's going to be an air-centric exercise this year with a maritime component. And that's commensurate to looking at the Pacific Theater writ large, because it's a maritime-dominated area of responsibility, or AOR. And so they want to make sure that we have good synergy in the air-sea cooperation between the Air Force and the Navy. And that is the underscore of the objectives of what we're trying to accomplish as we practice in a joint interoperability exercise this year. We're looking at making sure we have safety as a top priority always, as we look to employ all our techniques, tactics, and procedures to underscore all those training objectives. Additionally, we're looking at about the same scope and scale as we have for 2017. You can see those statistics there. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the JPARC, the Joint Pacific Alaska Range Complex, where we conduct the exercise. The bumper sticker we like to use is the 5th Generation Center of Excellence. This is the Department of Defense's most realistic demanding and training environment that we have, that replicates the entire spectrum of military operations and remains accessible in scale for the entire joint and coalition force. And this is the largest range that we have in the United States. We have 2 other ranges, one in Utah and one in Nevada, but this is the largest. So it is a fantastic opportunity for us to come in and train with our other services and also with our allies and partners. This allows us to also practice our multi-domain aspect of training for both live and synthetic joint integration to enable the full spectrum in the 21st century fight. We need to make sure, because as we talked about with the thaw in the Arctic and different things that are going on in the region, that we are maintain our competitive edge. So we have to have that high-end training environment so we can challenge ourselves. That way, as we get ready to conduct real-world operations, be it anything from humanitarian assistance or disaster relief, if there's a typhoon in the Pacific, or if there's peacekeeping operations, or worst case, if there's conflict that we have to resolve to maintain back to those peaceful operations, that we have the appropriate training ground to do so. And that's what we have here in the J Park. And that's why it's critically important for us to have this training ground here. If you can see highlighted there, that Whiskey Area 612, that's a sanctuary. You can slide, zoom in a little bit there. Yeah, so Whiskey Area 612 is a sanctuary space, so no other IFR or instrument flight rules traffic. Commercial traffic can intercede into that area. So that's dedicated for us to train. And that's great because it's still close to land, so we don't burn a lot of fuel getting to a training area, but our air crew can still practice over the water and coordinate with that naval presence that I spoke about earlier. So this is paramount for us to work on those seams and any coordination issues between the services so that we are actually working together instead of just alongside of one another. And that is what we use to, again, maintain our competitive advantage. All right. And now I'll turn it over to John to get into a little bit more detail about the TMA and the naval presence.
Thank you, Colonel. Again, I'm John Mosher. I work for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The fleet's headquartered out of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, but as Captain Davis mentioned, I'm located at Whidbey Island, Washington. So I'm the program manager for environmental readiness for the fleet in the Northwest and Alaska. I'm retired Navy, but now in that civilian job doing environmental planning for the Navy. As was mentioned, so the exercise itself has primarily an air component focus, so airspace activities with the joint services that are involved. So primarily in this case, the Air Force and the Navy working together. The Navy piece is relatively small to the exercise, but in recent years, the portion of the exercise that the Navy conducts at sea in the Gulf of Alaska has certainly been the topic of, I think, most interest and concern within the public. So that's primarily what I'm going to speak to. The TMA, or again, the Temporary Maritime Activities Area, that's the location of the, in the Gulf of Mexico, that portion, and the Gulf of Alaska, that portion that the Navy would be operating in. So all the activities that are at sea during the exercise would occur within that TMAA area. Now that area is just something that's defined for planning purposes for the military, for the environmental analysis that was done by the Navy to determine where we would do the activities to allow us to do an environmental effects analysis. It is not a restricted area, so other users of the marine environment can come and go as they please. We have no authorities or jurisdictions to limit other activities to occur within the TMAA. It is, as noted here, a very large area of sea space, so over 42,000 square nautical miles. So a lot of area for the Navy to operate, but also for all those other users of the marine environment to also operate as they need to. There are no restrictions again, and this includes both in-water restrictions or aviation restrictions. The majority of the Navy's activities occur pretty far offshore. On one of the previous graphics, there were some indications of distances that the TMA boundaries are from various points of land in Alaska, but the vast majority of the Navy activities are going to occur further offshore than those fringe areas. The one exception to that is if, in fact, during the exercise, a carrier, aircraft carrier is involved in the exercise and flight operations are occurring, that warning area, W612, that the Colonel spoke to, that is an area that the carrier would typically conduct flight operations at sea. So that's in the northern portion of the TMAA. The majority of the other activities that could be conducted, so anti-submarine warfare training, other anti-air warfare training, some of the other activities would typically occur further offshore and not right in that corner where the carrier would be operating. Important for the carrier, as the Colonel mentioned, both for safety reasons to operate in closer proximity to the land areas and the airspace ranges of the JPARC, but also for conservation of fuel. It takes quite a bit of fuel for some of the aircraft to operate, so if they're hundreds of miles offshore, it's going to eat up a lot of fuel. With each of the activities, we do have protective measures, and I'll speak to those on the next slide. So over a number of years now, the Navy's been operating in various training locations around the country and around the world. So some of the mitigations that we use are implemented everywhere we train. Others are very specific to a particular geographic location, like those here in the TMAA in the Gulf of Alaska. These mitigations have been developed over time. They've been revised and updated, working closely with the National Marine Fisheries Service. The Navy obtains permits to conduct the activities that we do through the National Marine Fisheries Service, very specifically to address requirements of the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. One of the important mitigations that we do is the implementation of mitigation zones, and these are applied when we conduct either active sonar operations. Again, sonar would be used primarily for anti-submarine warfare training, but also with various training events with weapon systems. So we implement these mitigation zones. They're essentially exclusion zones that the operation will either cease or be scaled back if there are marine species observed within those zones. The next one on the slide here, the Portlock Bank mitigation. This is an area very specifically to the TMAA and the Gulf of Alaska. It's in the kind of the northern proximity of the TMAA, if you're not familiar with that bank area. But it was identified a number of years back prior to the 2017 Northern Edge exercise as an area of important fishing grounds. It's a ground fish area. So the commitment to not use explosives at all in that area was the mitigation that was implemented at the time and that will continue for this exercise in 2019. Another important mitigation is the use of qualified marine mammal lookouts. So they go through a very rigorous training requirement to be qualified for what they do. These are lookouts that are put in place in addition to the normal shipboard lookouts that are looking for other vessels and things of that nature. They're very specifically looking for marine mammals so they can implement those mitigation zones that I mentioned. With the mitigations, there's also a reporting requirement. So during the exercise, the units involved have to track what activities they're conducting, and we have a requirement to report these to regulatory agencies, in this case, the National Marine Fisheries Service, after the exercise. And this leads into the next bullet, which is by reporting the monitoring, what we've seen, what we did, those types of details, we're able to coordinate for adaptive management. So as I mentioned, some of these mitigations have changed and been modified or improved over time. Those reports allow us to do that, improve how we conduct the activities, how we mitigate. In addition to the protective measures, there's also a lot of research that is conducted relative to the Navy's activities at sea. This is conducting and funding offshore population surveys and other marine species monitoring projects. And I'll speak a little bit more to that on another slide. Just to address some of the impacts to marine species from the Navy's activities at sea. And this information is pulled out of the environmental impact statement that was completed by the Navy, the supplement to the environmental impact statement that was completed in 2017. So to address two of the resource areas of most attention, fish and marine mammals. First with fish, The TMAA has minimal overlap with fisheries management areas. This was specifically determined, or the location of the TMAA and the training area itself was implemented specifically to avoid as much as possible those effects with other users of the marine environment. So in this case, with fishing activities. So that's in general, but specifically there is no overlap with salmon management areas. The use of mid-frequency sonar, and this is a point that I think is often misunderstood, but sonar itself, active sonar that the Navy uses, is not an impact on fish or shellfish. Most fish species don't even hear within the frequency bands that we use for these sonar systems, so they simply don't hear it, no effect. Also during the exercises, there is a very conscious effort to minimize the use of live explosives for training. And when these activities occur, like I mentioned before, they typically occur very far offshore, further out towards the middle of the TMAA. To address marine mammal potential for impacts, there is a limited use of active sonar. The sonar systems themselves, unlike with fish, marine mammals, depending on the particular type of marine mammal, can hear the sonar systems that we use, and there is the potential to affect, but we implement those mitigation zones, those protective measures that I addressed, to help reduce the potential for those effects. Very specifically, those zones are determined to avoid an effect that would be injurious, so actual injury to the marine mammal. It's not to say that that mitigation zone would allow detection of the whale at a distance that wouldn't even hear the sonar. That's not the intent. It's to stop the sonar, power it down, cease it entirely if the marine mammal was to come within that zone that is actually very close to the ship, that would be the level where injury could occur. And then also of note, so no marine mammal strandings have been associated with the Navy's activities in the exercise in the Gulf of Alaska, and no ship strikes with Navy vessels and marine mammals have occurred. Next slide. And just to speak a little bit to the marine mammal monitoring program I mentioned on an earlier slide, this is a really good news story that goes with all the activities that occur, but the Navy is a leader worldwide in marine species research. It is a requirement of some of the permitting that we obtain, and it helps the Navy determine what our effects are on marine species, but it also helps further that science for other users of the marine environment. So the information that comes out of the research that the Navy's funding is applied much more broadly to other sectors of marine activities. So it is helping everybody do things better, determine where the species are and how we can be more protective. Since 2009, specifically here for the Gulf of Alaska, the Navy's contributed almost $3.5 million specifically to these projects. And these are not conducted by the Navy, they're conducted by academic institutions, research organizations. And there's a website there at the bottom of the slide. A lot of good information on that related to the monitoring program itself, some of the projects that have been completed both here in Alaska and around the world, and then some of the actual monitoring reports that have been submitted after each of the exercises. Next slide. Thank you. And just to talk a little bit about the environmental planning, I did mention that the Navy completed a supplemental environmental impact statement with a record of decision in 2017. Through the process of the EIS, we also obtained those permits through the National Marine Fisheries Service. And these permits have a duration. So they are currently in place, but they expire in 2022. So with that, we have to start a new analysis, reanalyze the effects, look at what we do, where we do it, if anything's changed. So that project to reanalyze and obtain the new permits is kicking off actually this summer. It's about a 3.5-year process from start to finish, so it takes a while. to do all the different pieces of supplemental EIS, as well as those regulatory requirements with the National Marine Fisheries Service. Part of the EIS project process will be to engage with the public. So we will have a scoping period. We will have a release of a draft document, the opportunity to comment and review those documents. And then in addition to those outreach activities associated with the EIS process, there will also be an ongoing effort to engage with coastal communities, events like this, events like recently we attended the Alaska Forum on the Environment in Anchorage. We'll also be attending the Comfish Alaska event in Kodiak in a few weeks. So events like that, we try to take advantage of, leverage, have another opportunity to engage with the public and answer questions related to the activities and those programs that the Navy's involved in. With that, I'll turn it back over to Captain.
So we'd like to open it up to questions. I also included our contact information. Myself and Mr. John Mosher are probably the two best conduits for asking questions. And if we can't answer them, we can direct them to someone who will. So with that, we're happy to take your questions.
I have a question. My name is Taylor Kimber. I've lived in Cordova for 3 years now. I came here with my DD-214 in my hand, actually, and this is where I've been ever since. It's been kind of nice to live somewhere that's mostly unaffected by the military after getting out. But I've been following this issue for a few years now, and I'm seeing a lot of like trends with the way that you're communicating with the public. You know, like, of course, every time there's no findings of negative impact again and again and again by your scientists, but there's other science that suggests that there's actually significant impacts, especially to beaked whales. There have been, in fact, beaked whales stranded in this area. It's difficult to perform the crop season time, and it's hard to connect them to your standards, but I think there's reason to believe that beaked whales have been affected. They've certainly been affected elsewhere in the world by sonar activities. What do you think about, what do you say to that? So the various open-ended, unacademic questions.
I'll field that one. Yes, you make some very good points. So with the Navy's, and this is for the at-sea activities specifically with the exercise, I didn't mean to indicate that there are no environmental effects or from what we do. We do obtain permits from the National Marine Fisheries Service very specifically for exposures of marine mammals to various acoustic sources. So sound sources from sonar or from the use of explosive systems. So we do obtain permits that allow us to do those activities. So the effects are, you know, unintentional. They're incidental to what we do, and we do implement those protective measures to minimize the effects, but it's not to say there are no effects. Now, with that said, you bring up a good point, and I did mention, so there are, it depends on the whale species, the frequencies that they hear in. There's a number of different hearing ranges for different marine mammal species. You brought up beaked whales, and you're correct, that's one species or grouping of whales in particular that it is known through scientific research is sensitive to those sounds that are within the frequency range that we use for sonar. So beaked whales are one of those species very specifically that we've developed those mitigation zones for. The zones are based off of the best available science, and they are based off of, like I said, not intended to alleviate or eliminate all effects entirely. They're supposed to minimize the effects so it doesn't get to the level of injury. When strandings occur, and you mentioned that, typically if it's in an area that the Navy operates or in a time frame that the Navy's operating, like the exercise, there is a process for investigating those types of strandings. The National Marine Fisheries Service will come to us almost immediately when they occur, if they know or think we may have been in the area and operating, and we'll respond very quickly, indicating whether or not we had an activity going on. For those strandings that have occurred in Alaska, those have been investigated. The National Marine Fisheries Service has come to the Navy, and with all those strandings in recent years, none of those occurred when we were in the area operating with either sonar or weapons systems. So not to say that we can't affect that species of whale, but none of those specifically in this region were associated with our activities. So that's something we have to be aware of and careful of, and there are special considerations being given to beak whales because there is a sensitivity there for sure.
Is it worth it? If you lose 1 or 2 whales, what's the number for this notional idea of like national security, which I'm aware exactly of the limits of those kind of statements of national security and strategic importance. Because when you're actually downrange, you understand there's no actual good way to imitate warfare or combat. So you just pick an area where only a few whales are going to die, or maybe going to die. And
I guess I'm probably not in a position to answer that fully, but so that's the jurisdiction of the National Marine Fisheries Service. They determine what level of effect to a species is allowable. That's for fish, for marine mammals, for all species they have jurisdiction over. They determine what the level of effect is that's acceptable. So in our authorizations, our effects cannot be to the extent where we're significantly affecting the species. We can, in theory, affect an individual animal, but affecting the viability or the population of that species is where they draw their regulatory lines, I guess. So it's not our decision to make. We request permits, and then working with them, we develop those mitigations to help minimize the effects.
Kelly, go ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Charles Weaverly. I'm also a veteran. I was a former submarine sailor.
Kelly, could you use a mic? Thank you.
How's this?
Quite Mikey.
So, a former submariner. When I was in, the majority of the fleet was still diesel electric. That was a long time ago. But I rode diesel electric, fast attack, and FBM submarines. We did a lot of training while we were underway, and we also went on training exercises as well. So I clearly understand the need for training and readiness. I've also served as the mayor of this body, and I understand the value of a good fishery. The community would not exist without the fishery. Literally, it just would not exist. And gosh, you know, it seems like we go through these conversations very frequently. It's almost like deja vu all over again. And there's a lot to be considered, you know, and it's confusing how much damage would be done. We don't really know. And how much would it impact us? We don't really know either. I have some ideas about why you operate where you are. It looks like a good location. It's close to the Air Force Base, so that aircraft participating in the exercise can spend more time in participating in the exercise. And it is a long way away from us. We don't know, for example, how the impact is really going to affect us. But we can probably state with some certainty that your activities out there will not be a benefit to the marine species that we depend upon here for our economy. And probably it will not be a neutral effect either. It will be, I think it's pretty easy to understand, a negative impact on the marine species that we depend on. The question is, of course, how big an impact is that? Well, we don't know. We don't really know where the fish go, but we know where they go to. They go to the Copper River and they come to the fishing area around here. And we know when they do that. And when they do that is almost exactly in the time frame of your exercises. If you had chosen a time to have the most potential impact throughout the year on the species that come to our town, the time that you're doing it in would be that. So I'm coming to a question, I promise you I am. You probably know that this body, Legislative Assembly here, has passed a resolution opposing the time of the exercise at the very least. And not only that, but 11 other communities around the area, the training area, have also submitted resolutions opposing the timing. And I would like, once again, to reiterate that it would be best, I think, for everyone if you could find a way to adjust the timing of this particular exercise. I understand you need to practice. Readiness is very important. We also need to fish. And I guess that's it. You know, I've said this to you for many, many years. Last year, we had our Senator Lisa Murkowski bring some attention to this matter, and she brought 2 admirals here last fall, I think it was, to address this. And though I really appreciate, you know, the double helping of scrambled eggs, just having somebody more elevated in rank listen to us but not do anything about it doesn't really help us. So I hope that you will somehow figure a way to have this exercise at a time that is not so detrimental to our town. Thank you.
Would you like me to respond to that, or?
Yeah, I guess if you want to maybe head on to it.
So, sir, thank you for your points, and I apologize for feeling like you go through this in the deja vu piece, and we're constantly trying to improve our communication piece. Just trying to address a couple of things that you talked about. With the dates, the reason these dates were chosen is it goes back to the safety of our forces. So largely this is an aerial exercise. We're going to have aircraft that are overflying the Gulf of Alaska. And what the concern there was, if you have a pilot who's forced to eject and is in the water, if the sea states are out of a specific range, it becomes very difficult to do search and rescue operations to recover that pilot. So while the U.S. military is prepared and we always are thinking about operating in all sorts of different environments, for a training environment and a training scenario, there's only so much risk that we're trying to accept on that. So for this exercise, that was one of the primary drivers for those dates. We will take your feedback and we will continue to push that up to U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, who is the owners of this exercise, so that they receive this feedback, and as well as U.S. Pacific Air Forces, which is the organization conducting the event. So we'll pass along that feedback, but we're also balancing a lot of other factors which goes into that, to include the availability of forces, the availability of ranges. Like there's a bunch of things that go into that decision on when those dates are. So it's not a cut and dry decision.
If I can just chime in real quick, and I'll get right to you. In addition to the sea states and being able to pick up any downed airmen or sailors that may end up overboard, the prevailing weather in the fall is typically has lowered cloud decks than we have in the summertime. So when we have what we call an LFE, or a large force exercise, when you have so many aircraft in the air at one time, we only have so many usable altitudes that we can deconflict. So you get altitude blocked to thousands of feet. And so if you have a cloud deck that precludes the upper levels, now it pushes you lower to the ground as a useful working altitude. And we have a floor that's sanctuaried above the ground for a margin of safety. And so unfortunately, towards the latter portion of the year, it just becomes unusable for the amount of aircraft that we have operating at one time to be sustainable. So that's another reason where it pushes it towards the earlier portion of the year. But if we go too far to the left, then the temperatures and the sea states, it's just, again, from a rescue standpoint. So it kind of forces us towards that time of year. So we absolutely will take the feedback back to Indo-PACOM and to PACAF to have them take a look at it again, to deconflict, look at the weather, looking at the rescue opportunities and all the other exercises that they have going on with all the other players and partners that they have as well. So, but we definitely will take the feedback back.
Go ahead. we've been talking about marine mammals, and we've been talking about this being a fishing community, but the species that we do impact with the sonar, as far as commercial species go, is herring. Herring's about the most impacted species we still have in the area after the Exxon Valdez. Montague Island is the closest point of land to your little zone up here. You're within 12 miles there. That's herring territory there. Holding area is Montague Entrance, Montague Trench for herring. Our herring stocks are not doing very well now, and you're catching them at probably the worst time of year to do it. They've just gone through spawning, so they're going to be in the worst shape they're going to be. And kind of what you've been being alluded to by the folks here is we understand that we as a group and a nation need to exercise to figure out how to best protect ourselves in the eventuality of something bad happening, whatever it is. But we're feeling like we're being put as being the ones that are burdened to carry all the risk for all of this for everybody. And our voices really don't count, because we bring this up year after year after year, like everybody says, and we all get the same story. Oh, yes, we all love you, and this is all fine. We can't do anything else, so grin and bear it. And the story keeps getting old like that. And I'm not trying to beat you up, and I'm not trying to be ugly, but that's kind of how it feels from this end. We're carrying the risk for everybody.
If I may, to address the point you made with herring. So yes, I didn't specifically discuss that. I did mention in the brief on the slides that most fish species don't hear the sonar that we use.
Except our most impacted
Most.
species around here.
But you're correct. And then I didn't refer to, but there's the brochure that was on the table. They may be all gone. We only brought a handful. But there is a graphic on there that very specifically calls out what you were addressing. So it shows the frequency range that the Navy sonar operates in for mid-frequency active sonar, and it does show that one species, it's a hearing specialized fish species, herring, they do hear within that frequency range. However, there's also a reference on that same section, on that table, that refers to a study that was done not by the Navy, but by scientific researchers to look at those effects on those fish species that very specifically can hear the sonar. And the determination, I would encourage you to read the study. It is available. You can Google it from the reference that's here on the brochure. Even though they have the ability to hear at that frequency, the sonar does not appear to affect them. They've done significant tests to determine that. They didn't just make those determinations, but they go as far as saying the fish would have to be in close proximity, literally within tens of feet of the Navy sonar on the ship for 24 hours to be affected. Otherwise, it doesn't seem to respond at all to the sound. So can we say that's the case for every single fish species? No, but that test was done very specifically trying to address those species like herring that at least are known to have the ability to hear within those frequencies. So I would encourage you to look into that because our analysis still says that even though they can hear it, it's not a significant effect to them based on where they're located, where we're located, and they would have to be in close proximity for such an extended period of time. It's just not feasible. So there's a little more to it. And let me add one more thing. This is another point you made, sir. But so yes, there's been a lot of input that the time frame of the exercise isn't good. Some of the activities of the exercise are undesirable. It doesn't go without hearing, and it doesn't go without changes.
Anything.
And it was mentioned in the previous question too that the senator's been involved, high-level officials in the military have been involved, and believe me, they are still involved. They are hearing loud and clear the complaints, and they are taking into consideration the concerns, and changes have been made to the exercise over time and how we do things over time because of those comments. So there are changes. Your voice is being heard. It may not be changing everything that you would like, but there are changes, there are improvements being made, and we are listening.
Doesn't look like a lot of changes from our seat. And I'm not dissing you in that. It's the viewpoint we get.
I have a quick suggestion. Are you able to rotate? I mean, we have an even odd cycle here with our pink set, for instance. This is gonna be a big year. One of the impacts that we may have indirectly is that they spend the last couple of months of their life cycle fattening up out in the Gulf of Alaska in that big box somewhere. There's a study that the Science Center is doing now in conjunction with a dozen other organizations about salmon viability. We've had obviously a bunch of questions raised with climate change and the smaller returns. So, point is, why not roll it over into the Bering Sea? Why aren't, with the map you showed up early, I realize the logistics are huge, but there's that whole Chukchi Sea area to the north that is eventually going to have to be protected, and probably from oil spill more than from any kind of conflict, but seems like you guys ought to be able to flex some of this system as needed.
I understand that you are.
Hang on. We need to stay in order.
They're gonna keep saying the same thing again and again, Mr. Allison.
We need to stay in order.
Thing
Okay?
again and again. We can
Okay,
come at
come
them
on
with
up.
science, but they're not going to give us anything. No less than 11 rural coastal communities have basically pleaded with the Navy to change the timing of these activities. And that's what we care about, is the timing. That's the best we're gonna get, Navy. And I still don't know what my brothers died for in the Middle East, but I certainly know that they didn't die so that rural Alaskan communities, American citizens, could be ignored by the U.S. Navy. It's disgusting. As an Alaskan, as a fisherman, and as a veteran. And I know full well that in those uniforms, you might agree with me, but you're not able to act quickly or act at all because of general staffs and political officers and things like that. But you need to understand the impact that this is having, not just on our fishery, not just on our ecosystem, but on our faith in the American government, on the faith in our military. What are you protecting? What is there going to be left to protect but an empty ocean and bombed out landscape? We keep running these exercises year after year after year. I've been part of these ITXs, these CAXs, these WTIs. I speak this language, and I understand what's going on here. It's a huge expenditure of American taxpayer dollars. They're huge expenditures in munitions, which are paid for in money that far exceeds their value. There's powers of play that some people understand and some don't. Do you understand the impact this is having culturally and on the faith in our government? Do you understand that impact? Does that have any, do you have any understanding of that impact? Do you have a metric to measure that?
I'll go ahead and take that. We certainly appreciate the impacts that it's having in the community. And quite honestly, it does matter. We serve for a reason, and we are not intentionally out to harm this community. We're doing everything we can to understand your concerns, to take them back to the powers that are empowered to make decisions. Changes have been made. It is clear today that those changes have not been highlighted or articulated well enough to you. And that's one of the notes that I've made to take back, to clearly communicate, here's the concerns that you have made, here are the changes that have been made in response to that, and then when there is not an opportunity to make a change, to at least explain the constraints that preclude a change. Because if we're transparent as best we can be, then at least we'll take the feeling that we're doing it intentionally to harm you away from it, right? So if we can clearly articulate everything that we've done, all the concerns that we've received and what has happened in response to those, be it an actual change or I can't for these reasons, and if we can clearly articulate that, I think that may help explain what is going on. Because it sounds like the frustration is, from what I'm hearing from multiple people, is we say the same thing. You keep coming year after year, we say the same things and we don't get anything back from you. It's the same, song and dance, right? And that's not something that we're intending to do. And so now that we understand that, 'cause this is my first time coming, first time to Cordova, and first time hearing these concerns. But I understand that these concerns have been levied before. We're going to take these notes back and make sure that we can get answers to you, whatever those answers are. And we know changes have been made to this exercise from 2017. So we're going to work to do a better job in communicating those changes to you, so we're all on the same page about what we're doing to be a good steward and a good partner with you, and that way you don't feel like you are carrying the burden for everyone else. Is that fair? Thank you.
And sir, to follow up, you mentioned countless munitions and everything else that have been expended, and just in the framework of this exercise and for the purposes of trying to push some information to you, we're anticipating Northern Edge 19 is going to look like Northern Edge 17, and these were the numbers of actual usage for bombs and missiles and everything else. So you can see for Northern Edge 17 that 0 bombs were expended over the Gulf of Alaska, 0 missiles were expended over the Gulf of Alaska. There were 28 naval gun shells that were used, and those were all non-explosive. So they were an inert round, had no explosive in it, and then 2,500 small rounds of ammunition. So just so you have that information for your awareness.
And to add to that, and you may have been addressing activities of the military broader than just the occurrences here during Northern Edge, but as the captain mentioned, yeah, the level of activities here were fairly small in 2017. They're expected to be relatively small in 2019. I think there's also a misunderstanding that this is a 2-week exercise that occurs every other year. During that 2-week period, there's several days where these activities at sea are occurring, and during those several days, there's a few hours. An activity using naval gunfire, naval ships shooting small arms or shooting large caliber weapons only occurs for a couple hours during those particular days. So it's not 2 weeks nonstop of warfare training at sea. It's very limited events that occur. And then again, as on the slide here, the numbers themselves, we permit to a certain level through our documentation to allow us to train to a certain level, but execution isn't always what we permit to. We have to keep that capacity. That's why the numbers in the blue column there are quite a bit higher than what was actually used or implemented during that exercise. So there's a little bit more to the story, I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Kate Laird, and I run a boat from here out to the Aleutian Islands every summer, a charter boat. I've worked in Antarctica, I've sailed through the Southern Ocean, I've done hundreds of thousand miles at sea in the summer and the winter. And I'd just like to address the timing issue. If you're in Alaska in May, you don't need to be in Alaska. You could be anywhere in the world. It's the most benign time of the year. We do lose fishermen here out of our fleet, but I'd encourage you to go down to the docks. You haven't been to Cordova before. These are small boats, and they're fishing the surf breaks, and they're coming in through a bar. That's not the Navy. You don't need to be here in Alaska in the summertime. If you're going to train in Alaska, you need to be here in November, December, January. Susan's family's boat goes out every month of the year, just about. They're out here. Folks in this room have crab fished out here. They've iced. Boats roll over. They know what it's like to be here in Alaska in the winter. Being here in May, that's not training. It's not going to show you what fighting in Alaska is like. And the other thing I've said, I've got a degree in history, East Asian history from Harvard, and I feel that China is probably our next adversary in the Pacific. I think the Navy feels the same way, judging by their activities. They're not going to come in the summer. They're going to come in the winter. They've got guys running through here on commercial boats 12 months a year, coming through the Gulf of Alaska, through Eyak Pass. They know these waters. They know the way. If they come in here, they're going to come in the winter. And so I think I am appreciative of your talk about the risk of losing folks over the side. I lost someone 2 days ago who washed off in the Southern Ocean, good friend. So I know this, it's a risk, but that's something that's going to have to be faced if you're ever fighting in Alaska. The only reason to fight and train in Alaska is to train in the winter and to train when it's hard, not when it's easy, not when it's summer, not when everyone's wearing t-shirts.
Thank you for your comments. I'm sorry for your loss. So we have a multitude of different types of exercises all throughout the year. This exercise specifically is every 2 years for this 2-week period. We do have Alaskan exercises in the winter that are land-based, troops in the snow getting that Arctic training. This exercise, which is air-centric, is focused on a different type of air-sea coordination. So we have different training objectives for different exercises. So we are training for an Arctic fight in the winter, and that's a different exercise type. But this one is focused on a different set of training objectives.
But why does that have to take place in the Gulf of Alaska? I mean, it's a kind time of year in the Gulf of Alaska. You could be off the coast of San Francisco. Why does it have to be right in this location at this month of the year?
Oh, that's a great question. And so the first slide that I briefed to was outlining the J Park. And so we only have 3 large training regions in the United States, one in Nevada, one in Utah, and one here. This is the largest. And this is where the Department of Defense is investing all of their resources, not all of them, but a fair amount of resources for the 5th generation fight for F-22s, F-35s, and large-scale emitters and what have you. So this range has been designated as the future training range to integrate the other 2 ranges into. And so we also bring our coalition partners and international ally partners as well to train at this range because of the tyranny of distance is so large, and it's great to simulate the Pacific region because everything is disparate. It's far apart, right? And so if you mentioned China, so if you look at China, if we were to have an engagement with them, there's a lot of ocean between the closest land, either the Philippines or Japan or South Korea or what have you, to get to China. And so, you know, all that water we have there, a range in Nevada is too small to simulate the Pacific, and so is Utah. So this training range is the largest one we have, the only one that we can adequately simulate large distances across the Pacific, going from Hawaii to Guam or Japan or what have you.
So then why not do this in Guam or do it somewhere where you're not going to be causing these impacts on the wildlife in the key time of the key migration time? I mean, and you say this group needs to train, surely they need to train in the winter. I mean, it's just nothing like having ice on your deck and the ice on your wings, and you know, you can't replicate that in a summer training.
Yes, and so Guam, we actually do have a multitude of exercises in Guam, but the ranges there are a fraction of the size of what we have here in Alaska. So we train we have training exercise in Japan as well. We train with our allies, and we train all over. And so every place that we train has a different set of training objectives, and the landscape is different. You can get after different things, different climatology, as you talked about. Flying in Guam in the summer is completely different than flying in Alaska in the winter or Alaska in the summer. And we need that wide scope and scale of all those different environments, all those different training objectives and locations to ensure that we're prepared for anything that may come up. So we can't just throw all our eggs in baskets looking for one certain type. We spread it across the board, and that's why it's only 2 weeks every 2 years here, compared to the hundreds of other exercises that we participate worldwide all across the calendar.
Well, I think I'm hearing 2 things here. One has to be in May when it's benign because that's safer for the troops. And I'm also hearing that it has to be in Alaska because that's where the troops are. But it still doesn't answer the question. And I realize that there isn't perhaps an answer that's going to be satisfactory for that, that you're training at a time, the time that you're training here is benign and very unlikely to replicate combat situations. I mean, in the Aleutians War, we lost far more troops to the weather flying into mountains than we did to the enemy. And that's what weather's like out here. So that's the time to be training. You don't train for storms sitting in the harbor. You train by actually being out in a storm and seeing what it looks like. And if someone breaks their leg or is lost because you're in horrible situation, horrible seas, that happens when you're in those things without being in a combat situation, then you're ready for it in a combat situation. But I just don't understand why you're not training at the hardest possible time.
Okay.
I don't really need an answer to that because that's, your answer is they're here. I get the answer. I've heard it. I heard it last year. But
well, I can offer one additional aspect that I haven't introduced yet, resources. And so we try to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. And so if we can't take off because the weather precludes it, then we've invested tens of millions of dollars for this exercise to bring all these people to here, and then we can't take off because the cloud deck is too low. We don't have the visibility to take off. So again, we try to get the best training possible and to mitigate all the factors that we can. And so, but we can't, like, I like to use sports as an analogy, right? And so when you're practicing and you're scrimmaging, it's not the same level of intensity as it is in the fourth quarter in the finals. You just can't simulate that, like you alluded to earlier, right? You train as hard as you can, you try to simulate as best you can, but you have a certain amount of risk because if you overtrain your force in the hardest conditions, you actually do have breaks. You do have critical failures that can impede your ability to be ready for that next fight. So we have a risk matrix and risk dynamics that we take into account. And so we try to get the most robust dynamic training environment possible while mitigating risks, so that way we are prepared to fight the next day and to continue to train. So we try to take everything into account to be prepared for the entire spectrum of adversarial combat or military operations other than war, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, whatever the case may be, because it's not just about fighting, it's about everything that the military is involved in. And so we try to do as best we can. So that's
Yeah, I just like to leave it with one more thing, and then I'm going to step off and leave it for somebody else. But in the Falklands War, the Argentine military had 154 amputations for trench foot. British Army had none. That's because they train in the wet and the cold, and they all knew how to handle it.
okay.
And the Argentines were training in the warm weather, and they didn't know what to do with it. And I think that we need that level of preparation and not may.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more, and then we're going to be out of time here and have to start the council meeting, so.
Yeah, Dr. Mary Ann Bishop, and I'm president of the Prince William Sound Audubon Society. All the folks here have certainly voiced a lot of our concerns, and recognizing that the 2019 Northern Edge is going to take place in 2 months, we would want you to keep it small, use the minimum amount of vessels and subs, and restrict the use of any bombs and munitions. That said, I have 2 questions for you today, and my first one is, are you going to use helicopters with dipping sonar? And if you are, where would they be based, on the destroyer ship you talked about or out of Kodiak? So that's my first question, is about dipping sonar, if that's going to be used. And my second question has to do with the carrier strike group that you mentioned that has been requested. That's not defined that we could find anywhere in the EIS. Can you sort of describe what a carrier strike group is, how many boats that involves? So the dipping sonar and the carrier strike group are my two questions.
I'll address that. So yes, so the units that utilize dipping sonar are scheduled to participate in the exercise. Now, whether they're actually here during the exercise, I can't say for certain, but yes, they are scheduled to participate. They can either be located on the destroyers, the DDGs, but more typically they're located on the aircraft carrier. So if the aircraft carrier participates, then more likely those units would be involved and be stationed at sea on the aircraft carrier. They can land on the flight deck of the DDGs, the destroyers, but they don't base themselves on those platforms. So we do anticipate that that is one of the activities that would occur during the exercise in our best estimate right now. The other question, I'm sorry, was
about the carrier strike group.
Okay, so it varies actually. So a carrier strike group is an aircraft carrier, obviously is the basis for the strike group, and then it's a number of support vessels like the guided missile destroyers, the DDGs, but they can also be cruisers, they can also have submarines, they can also have other support vessels. It depends on the mission of the carrier strike group. So it varies in size. So I think it was pointed out, and I know we've received questions in the past, how we describe it in our planning document, our EIS document. It does vary in size. So there are a number of options to it. The number of vessels is not the measure of effect. I would say the measure of effect is more appropriately looked at the activities themselves. So in the analysis, though we don't specifically focus on 5 ships or 10 ships specifically, we focus on those activities that those ships would be doing and the level of sonar, for example, how many hours of sonar how many explosive rounds of large caliber projectiles would be used, those types. So we focus on the events and those metrics of the events that actually have the potential to affect. The ships themselves are just like other vessels steaming at sea. They don't have a large effect. We do measure some of the effects, emissions, from combustion of fossil fuels, things like that. We do measure the effects, but it's a lesser level, if that makes sense.
And so were there carrier strike groups in 2015, 2017?
No. So it's been a number of years since the carrier strike group or an aircraft carrier is involved in the exercise. As was noted in one of our slides, it's been requested for the exercise, so it adds a much greater level of complexity for exactly what the Colonel spoke about, naval forces at sea operating with other services, the Air Force operating at land, and then working together. That's a complex job. The different services in the military do things differently, and working together is vitally important. Every conflict that we've been involved in recent decades has involved joint operations. No service operates independently, so it's important. So adding the carrier strike group is an important benefit to the exercise to make it more effective at the level of training. I will also note that the number of aircraft carriers are limited. They are a critical national strategic asset. So they are ships that can be their schedule can be changed. So right now, if I was to guess, is one going to participate? I would say yes, it's in the planning. It is requested. So if I was a gambling man, I would say yes, it will participate, but that can change at moment's notice. So.
But if they do participate, would that change the number of potential missiles or bombs or those kinds of things, munitions?
It changes the forces that are involved. So yes, like I mentioned, so if the carrier and the air wing with the carriers involved, that's more forces involved on the Navy side of the exercise. So there is the potential for more activities to occur, yes.
Much more sonar, I would take it to protect the carrier. Not just intermittent blasts.
Well, yes and no. So it depends. So right now, there are no scheduled submarines to participate in the exercise. Without submarines, the anti-submarine warfare training has limitations, simulations that have to occur. So without a submarine, the level of training is likely less because it's not as effective training without that real platform to use as a target.
Mm-hmm. But right now, there are no submarines scheduled.
That's my understanding right now, none are scheduled to participate.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. As you can see, it's an important topic for our community, and my thoughts were right along with former Mayor Weaverling's. In the timing is just the worst for our community, and I think that's most people's big concern. You've heard the concerns. We trust that you'll take those back and take those into consideration, and this is our lives. Your training, and we appreciate that, and we know it's important, but we can't survive without our fish either. So thank you for coming. Thank you, audience, for participating, and know that we'll be watching.
Right.
So thank you.
Thank you.